Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We will just give everyone a couple more minutes to show up, and then Brian will start our presentation. Good morning. Welcome, everyone.
Looks like some people brought their A game today with their backgrounds. This is great. Yeah, we've got virtual backgrounds, and we've got just well curated backgrounds as well.
Brian, you need to work on yours a little bit.
I know. It's coming.
Listen, every city council meeting, I try to go to a different part of our house and show different paintings that we have. This is in the north end of our living room.
Well, Councilor Anderson, you might look at my background here. This is the separated bike lane, buffered bike lane downtown on High Street, right in front of my office. The one that people say no one ever uses it, but I snapped this photo of family using it. You know,
perfect. You can snap a photo of me using it almost every day, Mike.
Well, tell me what time you'll be there.
Yeah, I go to the post office about 10 on my bike.
Okay. But my office looks down on that bike lane, and I see it all the time. I see it used a lot, you know. So.
The same people who don't see the bikes only see empty buses.
Yes. I think perception affects reality. Perception is everything, right? So.
We got somebody wandering off into the flowers now. Well, what do you think, Kim? Should we get started and let the stragglers join as they come in?
Yeah, let's kick things off.
All right, folks. I'm going to go ahead and screen share just from a high level here. We're going to spend about 20 minutes or so, depending on how much coffee I've had here, walking through some slides and doing a little bit of a live demo of one of the tools we'll be using, so you have a concept of what that is. And then we're going to use the rest of the time for some Q&A. So this meeting we've got an hour scheduled, and I've got about 20 minutes of content. So I'm looking to all of you for some great questions to further the time we've got here. All right. So I'll look for a nod from Kim. You should be seeing a PowerPoint here. Is that right? Okay, great. So I recognize a lot of faces, and I also know we may have some new folks here. So we're gonna spend just a couple minutes doing some recap, so bear with me. My name's Brian Harmon. I'm an associate with Veritas Group, and I do quite a number of different things at Veritas Group, but I do spend a fair bit of time working with greenhouse gas modeling and inventories. And if you were at our second workshop, you'll recall we spent quite a bit of time walking through Salem's 2 greenhouse gas inventories, so that's kind of where we are now, so to speak, knowing that's 2016. And what we're talking about today is primarily really where we're going next, okay? And I'm just going to take a quick pause here for about 5 seconds. I'm not going to read through all these again, but if there's anything up here that is bolded that you're unfamiliar with or need a quick refresher on, I'm just going to wait for 5 seconds to let you go ahead and read the terminology there. Excellent. That way you don't have to suffer through me reading them all to you again. But these are some terms that may or may not come up today as we're walking through. And I will do my best to avoid abbreviating, but I'm pretty guilty of that sometimes. So you'll recall we have 2 greenhouse gas inventories for Salem. Both are for the calendar year 2016. One of them is what we call consumption-based. So that really focuses on the residents of Salem. That's what they're doing. That's the goods and services they're purchasing. And we're really leaving that one behind for today's discussion, but it is there. And we're focusing in on this sector-based inventory. And so this measures the emissions that occur within the boundaries of Salem. And there's some important caveats, but that's kind of the way to think about it is if it occurs within the geographic boundaries, it doesn't matter who caused it, they count. And so I am going to mention a couple of examples because these did come up in our last discussion and in discussions outside of that workshop. So as you probably well know, Salem's not unique in that most cities generate electricity outside of their city boundaries, right? And so even though it's consumed within, it's produced without, and that still counts in a sector-based inventory, and so that would count in ours. Likewise, waste is produced within your city, and very few cities dispose of all of their waste within the city limits. So we would still count waste that leaves the city limits to go to a landfill or to go to the Covanta plant. And then the third one to be aware of is that you have quite a number of folks who are going to drive through your city. And they might not stop at all. They may be going from a point A to point B, and you're just in between. And their VMT, their vehicle miles traveled, would still count. And all 3 of these sort of caveats, so to speak, really align with what we see with best practices in really, I mean, any greenhouse gas inventory protocol that I'm familiar with. So just want to make you aware that those 3 things are, especially the first 2 are really kind of exceptions to the rule, but they're well regarded and a normal exception, so to speak. So we're going to talk about 3 parts of the process today. The first is the inventories, which is really where are you now? Now, of course, being 2016. And then we're going to talk about forecasting, which is where are you likely to go out to 2050, which is the date that we care about, for at least for now. And then planning, which is where will we be if we take certain actions? Or another way to think of that is what impact might a certain strategy or action have on your overall emissions, okay? So we're going to start with the inventories, and this is going to be super fast because we spent quite a bit of time on this again, but it's important, or I think useful at least, to have that number kind of in the forefront of your head. So we're just talking about the sector-based inventory here.
Brian, can I interrupt you real quick?
Please.
I didn't even ask you. Ken Beerley has a question. Do you want to take questions in the midst of your talk, or do you want to save them till the end?
I'd prefer them at the end, but if they're really timely and you're gonna have a burning ear for the next 20 minutes, then I'll take them as we go. And sorry, I didn't see your hand raised there.
Ken,
Okay.
Are you okay waiting till the end?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Perfect. And if that changes, or if you have another question that comes up that you can't wait, I will answer it, or I'll do my best at least to answer it. Thank you. So as you recall, you've got about 1.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent being released on an annual basis. A little bit more than half of that comes from your transportation, a quarter from your electricity use, and then the remaining quarter comes from a variety of sources. So that's really the recap. We talked about that pretty well in depth, and we're going to move into the forecasting. Okay. And I want to make sure that this slide really gets across from a conceptual standpoint. I'm going to walk through some kind of graphical representations of what I mean when we're talking about the forecasting and the planning sections. And what I want to make just as abundantly clear as possible is I made up all the numbers here. So they don't mean anything past 2016, which is your start date. I'm solely doing this to demonstrate what it might look like. So you shouldn't take away anything in terms of numbers or in terms of strategy discussion from this. Just don't want that to get lost. So what I mean when we say where are we going is this is kind of what's in my mind when I look at that, right? You've got a number you're starting with, which is 1.5 million, and you're going to be going somewhere for the next 30 years or so out to 2050. And your emissions are going to come from a variety of sources. These are the sources kind of wrapped up at a high level that we're tracking in your inventory. So from Veritas Group's perspective, that what we're going to be doing is we're going to create several baselines, several versions of what you're seeing right here. This is probably not one of them, but the intent is to basically create the most likely scenario for what 2050 looks like, or several scenarios that seem quite likely based on what we know today. And I think that what we know today is a great caveat. If we had done this, or anyone had done this in 2016, they certainly would have missed COVID-19, right? And that's had a huge impact, at least for a short period of time, on our GHG emissions. And so it's just important to know that we're going in with some unknowns that are just, to be frank, pretty impossible to know when we're talking about a 30-year time horizon. But there are some assumptions we can talk about, and those are going to be things like population growth. That's going to be things like the fuel mix for your electricity. And it might be other things like the rate at which people adopt their electric vehicles. So you can imagine all three of those are going to have some pretty substantial impacts on your emissions. And as we make some different assumptions about those, that could have some pretty dramatic implications for what 2050 might look like. So these are two of my personal favorite quotes from a gentleman named George Box, who's, if you're a statistician dork like myself, he rises to the top as a pretty well-known and friendly-looking gentleman who said, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So my made-up model I've just shown you is certainly wrong. It may or may not be useful. The ones we're going to generate will be useful. And then my personal favorite quote from him that you see a little bit less commonly is that it's inappropriate to be concerned about mice when tigers are abroad. What that means is if we can create a robust and well-informed model, we know it's going to be wrong. We can still use it as a useful model. And when I think of your emissions, for example, I get very focused on your transportation, your electricity, and your stationary combustion. Those are your tigers, right? That's the vast majority of your emissions today. Okay, so we're going back to that graph and we're going to add some lines on it that are important for context for Salem, right? You have some goals. You have a 2035 goal for a 50% reduction, and you've got a 2050 goal for a net zero future. And so in this forecast I've created, it looks like you might hit that 2050 goal. Maybe, maybe not. It looks like you'd miss that milestone along the way. So that's where the planning element comes in. This is the idea of, we've worked on a number of different strategies. How might those strategies impact one or more forecasts that we are going to create? So again, this is that same graph. And now we're going to start asking, okay, if we add certain strategies, what's that going to do to the forecast? So let's put an example here of some sort of EV incentive program. And again, caveat here, these are made up numbers. Don't take away anything from me recommending that this is the top one or that this is its impact. But what you'd see in this example is that all emissions stayed the same, except for I shifted the transportation emissions down. So this program, which I'm making up on the spot, might be some sort of rebate program or something like that in order to influence the rate at which EVs are purchased by Salem's residents and gasoline vehicles or diesel vehicles are phased out. So seems like a great program. Certainly it seems like it may help you out to 2050, but in this case, you would still miss that milestone. So we might add another one, and this is some sort of net neutral carbon natural gas phase-in program. So that might be phasing out natural gas, that might be changing the fuel mix, that might be taking it from better sources, et cetera. It doesn't really matter in this case what it is, just that it seems like that might mean you're over or that you've achieved your 2035 goal. And then if I were to say, you know, maybe we're not quite comfortable, we're still pretty close, what would a third one do? So let's say that your two electricity providers achieve carbon neutrality and change the rate at which they move towards those goals. So when we layer those three things on, we see that when I would look at this, I'd say, well, it looks to me pretty certain, even knowing that there's going to be some things wrong with this model, there's a pretty good gap between where we think you'll be and where you need to be. So I would say with some confidence, it looks like we're good to go with these 3 strategies to hit your 2035 milestone. And it still looks like you'd probably hit your 2051 as well. So this is what we call a wedge analysis. And it's quite simply that when you looked at those areas that we were looking at before, those are the wedges, right? And the idea here is to pursue a number of strategies. We're looking personally at about 10, and we're going to look at 10 strategies. And so now we're kind of diving from the conceptual into the practical about what we will be doing moving forward. We're going to look at 10 strategies, and we're going to weight these in order to select which strategies to move forward on for this modeling exercise. And they're going to be weighted by 4 things. That's the cost for the city to implement them. It's basically what we consider to be the, for lack of a better term, the ease of the city to be able to implement them. So that's kind of excluding budget. What sort of red tape is there? Is it something that the city actually has the jurisdiction to do, for example? If it's impossible for the city to implement, then certainly it's something we should be very cautious about moving forward on. It's the greenhouse gas impact it's going to have, and then it's the impact, who it's going to have an impact on, this idea of all residents versus new residents, which I'll touch on in just a second here. So basically, we're going to select some strategies. These are going to be strategies that came from a number of places, but primarily from that workshop, and focusing on the energy and transportation sectors more than anywhere else, because that's where the majority of your emissions come from. We're going to work with experts and do some independent review of what other cities, other climate action plans, and what other experts would recommend in terms of both the inputs and the outputs. So what I mean by that is we want to know what's possible to do. My example back to that EV program, let's say that's something that we selected, and let's say it's a rebate program. Well, what's financially feasible? Certainly the city's not going to go out and buy everybody an EV tomorrow. So that's so far on the crazy side of the spectrum, it's just not going to happen. So we need to determine what's the feasible range of realistic to pretty much optimistic in terms of the input. What could the strategy be in terms of the range? And then we want to know what the output's going to be for that. And both of those are working with experts and doing research to determine the impact. So then when we layer those on, like in our last graph, what you'll see is that we start with some forecasted view of where we think you're going to be in 2050, and then we can have an informed discussion about how these strategies will impact your overall emissions. So I'm going to go back and answer what I mean by this all residents or new residents. I think this is a good piece of context to have. So this is going to be a very simplistic example, solely to be an example. It's not perfect in terms of the absolutism in which I'm speaking here, but this is a made up mixed use development that I've decided is going into Salem. It's going to be built tomorrow. Okay. And so this is great. It's got, you can't see them, but it's got a number of solar panels, EV charging stations, all sorts of great things that I would absolutely be excited to see Salem pursue in a development. Okay. What this has now done is attracted a large number of new residents, and those residents might have instead purchased single family homes and extended the boundaries, but instead they chose to live here. So we're happy about that. But what we've done is increase the overall number of people that live in Salem. And at least in my example, we've increased the emissions, right? Their per capita emissions, each person we've added here has significantly lower emissions than the average resident that lives there today, but they're still adding more, okay? And so it's important context that Salem, we certainly don't want Salem to build themselves out of a goal, right? If we add lots of new single family housing, lots of bigger, better roads, so to speak, that's not the way to go, right? That'll make achieving a goal much more challenging, but it's also important context to realize the only people's emissions we've lowered in this example are the new residents. Their neighbors, who all live in single family homes, have largely been unimpacted by this. And so it's not to say this is unimportant, it's very important, but it's also to say that we should definitely, and that's why it's part of our weighting system, consider the people that currently live in Salem, because there's no way to get to zero emissions without also influencing their emissions. So I'm going to jump gears a little bit. That was sort of the hypothetical. What I want to spend a few minutes doing is a bit of a live walkthrough of ClearPath. So ClearPath is a tool, and it's been developed by ICLEI. And ICLEI is just one more acronym for the whole pile, but it's basically ICLEI is a organization that has developed the U.S. Community Protocol, which is one of several very well regarded protocols for a city to use. Okay, and their tool has 3 things in it that we're going to talk about, which should look familiar. It's inventories, it's forecasting, and it's planning. So I'm going to hop out of the PowerPoint here, and we're going to freewheel it for just a little bit. So I will say, if you're curious about the US Community Protocol and you enjoy reading, I hope you can see the URL up here. The US Community Protocol is freely available. It's essentially, you do have to submit some basic information about yourself. I don't work for them, so I can't guarantee they'll never email you, but I can tell you that they've never bothered me, and I've downloaded without me asking, and I've downloaded their protocol several times now. So if you submit your information, you'll be redirected to a download where you can download any portion or the entirety of the US Community Protocol. So this is ClearPath. ClearPath, as you'll see up here in the top, has inventories, forecasting, planning, and some other pieces. We're not going to go through everything, but I want to give you an idea of just kind of what it is we're talking about, because this is the primary tool we will be using in order to do the forecasting and planning sections. I'll add an important caveat, which is that the planning section, which is where the strategies are, doesn't have every possible strategy. There's just, to be frank, too many out there. And so if we're not able to model something within ClearPath, we will export the data, and then we will model it using the US Community Protocol, which is what ClearPath is built on. So we don't necessarily lose anything by doing that. We just will be doing it essentially outside of this tool. So if you look at our inventory here, you'll see we've got one inventory. It's yours for 2016. Our first step here is that Salem used the greenhouse gas protocol for cities in order to do their 2016 inventory. And so we took that data and we ported it in here, okay? And so it at a really tigers and mice level, the 2 inventories are incredibly similar protocols for the most part. And so it doesn't really impact your inventory. It's really just in order to be able to do the rest of the steps, we need to start with an inventory in here. So that's what we've done. We've taken your data and we've basically moved some buckets around in order to get your emissions into the right places for this protocol. But largely, that is to say, they're basically the 2 most commonly used protocols for cities, and they're incredibly similar when you dive into the details. But what you'll see across the top here are a number of tabs. For the sake of everyone's sanity, I'm not going to spend your time going through each one of these. But what it comes down to is that you've got data within each one of these that corresponds to your previous inventory. So this isn't new data. It's just a new way of looking at your data that looks an awfully lot like the old way of looking at your data. Okay. So we've got this forecasting module, and the forecasting, again, is we just want to predict what 2050 looks like. And there's 2 pieces here, which we'll dive into. So the first is forecasting, which we'll come back to, and the second are factor sets. So if you'll recall, when we were talking about the forecasting, we have to make some assumptions about what the world looks like in order to model it. So the world in 2050 isn't going to be the exact same as it is today. So you being me, kind of the royal you, need to build a number of different assumptions in order for us to have a model. And I'm going to just give an example here, or 2 examples. So I've created 2 possible scenarios for your population growth. One of them, Salem no change, I'll tell you is wrong and not useful, which is that the population never changes from, in my case here, I put 2010, but 2016 on. So you have no net increase or decline in population. So that's one possible future. We know it's not the case, but there might be some places where I'd want to pop that in for something else. Okay, and now we have much better data out there about what your population might look like in 2050. And so we've plugged in the percentage growth through time in order to model one possible future. So I'm gonna argue again, this is wrong, but it's probably a whole lot more useful than the no change, okay? And so what you end up with are a number of different factor sets. I could build a third one here, for example, that would be your utility emissions factors. And we know what it is today, and we know that there are goals, and we could model achieving or failing to achieve those goals and what impact that has on your emissions out through 2050. So that's factor sets, and that's all I mean when I say that. It's just creating basically the numerical, the math really behind the forecasting. So we come back to the forecasting here. The tabs up top are going to look identical, I believe, to what we have in the inventory. And it's just each piece of that inventory we now need to come down and make some assumptions about. So again, you can see here your, a good example here is your electricity. Well, we need a growth rate. So how much energy is going to be used through time? One possible one could be that you have your population growth mirrors your energy growth. It's probably not exactly right, but it's at least a place to start for an informed conversation. And then we've got here the carbon intensity factor. So that's how much carbon you're using up per unit energy you're producing, or which corresponds to your fuel mix for your utilities. So a wrong but possible option would be to put no change in here. We just assume that what your utilities look like today is what they look like in 2050, okay? Now, these aren't necessarily the ones we'd move forward on, but that's conceptually what this looks like. So essentially, as you can see, you'd come through for each tab, you'd come through and make some assumptions for a number of different pieces, okay? And each one of these pieces, you can assign unique factors to in order to create a very complicated, if you wish, future about 2050. So the third, and I'd argue kind of the meat and potatoes, or the maybe the tofu and broccoli of this tool, I think the far more interesting part has really three pieces to it, okay? And this is your planning, this is your strategies, this is what we care about, because while we want to know where we're likely to be in 2050, we also have a goal, and we need to do work to achieve that goal. So the first part is probably unsurprisingly goal setting. So we can put in goals here in order to give us a concept of what we're trying to achieve. So you can just think about these as those horizontal lines on the graph. We can obviously set them for whatever we want. I've created here, absolute goals. You can get more complicated and think about trying to create some per capita goals if that was something that another jurisdiction might, for example, be working towards. And then we've got our strategies. Okay, and these strategies, I'm just going to give an example. Again, I'm going to pick something out of the transportation world because I think a lot of folks here are both interested in transportation, and it's a fairly easy place to stick. And we've got electric vehicle promotion, so I'm just going to go with that for now. We might as well continue with a fairly consistent example here. So essentially, for each strategy, we need to come up with a number of assumptions. And this is where the expert opinion, this is where the research, and this is where really sensitive and key discussions come in about, okay, let's say we decided to go ahead with this rebate program. What does that really mean? And we need to come up with a realm of what's possible on the input side in order to understand how that's going to affect your emissions. So in this example, there's a number of assumptions here that need to be created. And I don't know how big or small this is on your screen, so I'm just going to read a couple of them. We would need to understand today what your VMT looks like. We would need to understand your average fuel economy and the number of vehicles displaced by electric. And there's quite a number of other assumptions here. So when you put these all together, it creates one possible outcome for that strategy. Now, if we go back to the planning, you can create a new planning scenario. I've got a very, again, don't run away with these numbers. The purpose here is to show an example right now. This is a possible future for Salem, okay? This is a very simplistic example and not one that would, at least in its exact form, be a final output. This basically assumes essentially a small increase through time because Salem's going to have more people in 2050 than it does today. So if we look at your increase, it'd say that out in 2050, you're closing in on 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. You can see you've got a 2035 goal here, which you've missed, and a 2050 goal here, which you've missed, okay? Again, not suggesting anything with these numbers. It's a scenario. So if this is where we were starting, well, then I think the runaway here is, oh boy, we need to put some strategies in place in order to drive down this wedge, so to speak, our wedge analysis to impact that. So I threw together 4 examples here, and I will tell you, don't worry, this isn't what we're suggesting 2050 looks like, nor are we suggesting these 4 strategies will save you from being there in 2050. But let's go ahead and add on that EV vehicle promotion here, and we'll rerun our example. And you can see here the wedge analysis. Essentially, we've shifted down from being up here to being down here. So we've shaved off a fair portion of our transportation emissions through time. That's that yellow chunk, right? So just like in our example earlier, we don't really see those other pieces being significantly influenced with the way the assumptions went into this. We can add some more and we'll see some additional bump down. So the idea here is that as we create realistic forecasts for what 2050 looks like, and we create well-informed strategies for how we're going to change that, when we put those 2 things together, we get a useful and I think well-informed model of what 2050 is going to look like. And so this helps drive the conversations at a different level about what types of strategies should be put in place and how that's going to help you get to your goal. Thanks for putting up with me for a live demo there. Okay, so I think the obvious question is, well, what are the next steps in this process? We've talked about 3 pieces here. The first is the inventory. So we've got your inventory ported into the ClearPath model. There's still a little QA, QC to be finished up there. So, you know, I'm not willing to go to court on any of the numbers that are in there at this moment, but they're basically in alignment with where your original protocol inventory got you to. And when we get finished with that, you will likely notice that there are some very small differences. And by small, I mean, you'll probably be within a 1% difference from your GPC model. And that's just some of the specificity around the model is going to lead to slightly different outcomes. So a little bit of QA, QC to finish up there, but that one's largely done. The forecasting, well, this is the data collection. This is what assumptions do we really need to nail down, the research, and then the modeling exercise itself. And then the planning section, this is the ranking and selecting of strategies. That's underway. I'm not ready to divulge all of our top 10 today, but we are working through that. And I'll share that they tend to be things that are related to, because of the way they're balanced, they tend to be things that are possible for the city to do and that have a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly for people that are already there, although not entirely. And they tend to be related to both energy and transportation because when you think about your overall pie, that's where most of your emissions are. And later this week, so Friday and into next week, we'll be having some discussions with folks in city planning and over at ICLEI in order to get some of these finer details nailed down. So all 3 of these are really happening simultaneously right now. And that kind of just gives you a little bit of an update on where we are in that process. So I know that some of you, and I appreciate your patience. I know I took 30 minutes and there was a question 4 minutes in. So I appreciate you holding your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. And I'll give the caveat that I'll give you the promise that if I'm unable to answer them in this presentation or in this workshop, I will reach back out to you with a more complete answer. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing and I'll open it to some questions.
Brian, I have a question. It seems
Please.
like there's an intermediary step that we need to take, and it's for your base forecast. Many of the actions that will reduce emission are going to be driven by the state or the feds, and it seems to me that we want to look at what sort of city actions net state and federal actions to reduce emissions. And so we really have a sort of the right framework for what the city needs to accomplish.
Yes, you're correct. Sorry, you're 100% right, and that is I gave a couple of quick examples of what types of things will be in that forecasting, but you are right on that. So the purpose for the 2050 forecasting is basically to ask, essentially at a very simple level, like if the city were to do nothing and just let the future play out, what does that look like? And so that would include things that happen both at a federal level, which can be a bit challenging sometimes to know where we're going, and at a state level. And if they are things that are set at a state level, but they have to be driven by a city, then those things, those get a little bit challenging to determine whether we forecast that or we put that in as a planning, but those things will pop up.
Brian, I've got a question that kind of
Please.
relates to John's twofold. What he's really talking about is how do organizations outside the city affect what we're doing, state, national, et cetera. Two other organizations outside the city are the utility providers. And I know they've set some pretty ambitious goals. So let's assume that they can reach those goals. I presume that it's going to drive down the utility emissions of GHG a whole lot. So I presume you're going to be modeling those in your forecast for us.
Yeah, so we have we've done the research on the goal setting for all three of those, for Salem Electric, PGE, and Northwest Natural, and we've reached out to members at all three organizations to get some additional details, because the rate at which they achieve those goals also, even though it doesn't impact your ability to hit a 2035 or a 2050 goal, does impact the overall amount of emissions being released. And so those will be in there as sort of your baseline scenario. And
Great.
You're correct that if you assume that all three organizations are essentially carbon neutral in 2050, then you erase roughly 35%, 40% of your total carbon footprint, because that would basically take away your electricity and your stationary combustion emissions, which leaves you essentially with transportation to deal with, which I realize there are organizations working on transportation as well, and then leaves you with some of those smaller pieces of the pie.
The last question I have for now relates again to John's question, and I put it in the chat room, and I suspect at some point you're going to want to go to the chat room and answer some of those that are there already. What's the effect of I-5 traffic? I mean, not every city has a big interstate going right through the middle of it, and we've got absolutely no control over the kind of vehicles that are passing, from the north to south of our city every single day, and that's only going to increase, I would presume. So we can't affect that. So, how does that negatively affect our ability to reduce GHG from transportation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my understanding, and just in case anyone's not aware, we being Veritas Group did not do the original sector-based inventory. So my review of it, my understanding is that your I-5 VMT is included, and that would correspond with sort of best practices from the US Community Protocol and GPC's protocol. So that's right in terms of it's in there. And it is also right that you have relatively little to almost no influence over what's coming through I-5. I mean, certainly you're not going to, and the state's not going to, and the feds are not going to move I-5 outside of Salem. So that piece of the pie is going to remain. So it's important, and my understanding is that the overall VMT on I-5 is a relatively small proportion of your total VMT, although I'll get clarity on that from the city tomorrow. But so you're kind of stuck with it, and you're right. And it's unfortunate, but I also wouldn't get hung up on it, because the goal here is slightly different than what the actual goal setting and inventory exercises achieve, right? It's a model. It's true that you can't really move the needle on a small portion of that model very effectively. And I guess I would say I wouldn't worry about that. There are a lot of other things that you'll be doing that are really important. that'll reduce emissions. And it's also true that Oregon itself has a very ambitious goal for reduction. So those emissions will decline with time. Got some hands up. I'm gonna look in the chat here just so I make sure that I know, Ken, you asked a question 4 minutes in, so I got to give you an opportunity here to ask it. I can read it, or if you want to ask it again, I'm happy to answer it.
Well, it's very similar to Tom's question in that there are significant areas, developed areas that are outside the city's city boundaries, city limits, Jan Ray, Lancaster area that are fully developed. They will contribute to greenhouse gases regardless of what happens within the city boundaries. So the question I have is how, if we're talking about greenhouse gases, they're not restricted to the boundaries of the city. However, the limits on what the city can do is bounded by that. But will there be in any kind of analysis of how that would affect our ability to meet the goals?
Well, yeah, a couple pieces of information. One, there we do have, so what's presented today is talking about, in terms of the inventory, is talking about the city of Salem. We do have a separate numbers for the UGB. So some of that legwork is already done. I would say that you do have the ability to influence emissions, even if they come from people that live elsewhere. And so an example of that would be that the majority of your workforce does not live in Salem, which means they commute in every day. And there are a lot of things that the city could choose to do to impact that. And those are kind of your emissions, so to speak, because as soon as they cross that geographic boundary, they start to count. So when they're driving out, in Lancaster, for example, it doesn't count towards your inventory until they cross the boundary, and then everything within does. Now, if you were to go, for example, to like an EV rebate program, being my example I keep repeating, would only influence your own residents, right? I mean, the city's not going to pay for other people to have EVs, but you might do something else like a trip reduction ordinance that would impact that 60% of folks driving in. So there are ways you can reduce your emissions, even if for the whole urbanized area, and also for the portion that counts towards you based on the actions taken by the city and others. That said, I mean, there are certain things that you're just not going to be able to influence. And I wouldn't get lost in the, like, as the guy who's focused on the models, don't get lost in the models. There's something bigger at stake here. Okay, so Ken, I hope that answered your question. Your hand's still up, so okay. Janet, you were the next. That's a statement on ICLEI. Yes, I was guilty of not putting the full name in there. So International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. Thank you. And let's see. Oh boy, there's so many comments. You guys put quite a number in there. Let's see. I see some hands up. So Janet, would you like to ask a question or a statement?
Yeah, sure. I have kind of 3 asks and 1 question. So ask number 1 is, can you give us either by email or posting on the website the list of all of your data sources that are your inputs into the model? I really want that. Number 2.
Can I pause and ask you a question on that?
Oh, sure.
Just so I have clarity. So there's sort of 3 opportunities for data inputs. One's the initial inventory that's already done. The second is the forecasting. The third is the planning exercise. Are you asking for on all 3 or one specifically? What piece are you particularly interested in, or all of them?
I mean, all of them, if you have time to do that. But most immediately, like the first one.
The inventory.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I'm kind of assuming that you're putting in more information than just the 2016 inventory. Like you've got the PGE information that you were talking about, and like you have some other data sources, right?
Well, so there's the inventory, and that's done. And then I think what you're asking is about the forecasting now, how we're going to move forward.
Okay.
Not where we were, right?
Sure.
So the forecasting of like how we're going to get out to 2050, assuming the city does nothing, just like the most likely possible future without city input, that will include a number of sources. And it will start using the number of the inventory, but where it goes will depend on but all three of your utility providers, some discussions with folks at the city departments, and some additional research as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we can share those.
Yeah, because like Northwest Natural is, projecting, 0% emissions by 2050, which is absurd. So I would really like to know those data sources. Also, if you create a business as usual scenario, I would ask that you not include the executive order on climate in that business as usual scenario, because, it's not in law, it's not in statute, the next governor could overturn it. So I would suggest if you want to do like a business as usual scenario and then do like a business as usual plus with the executive order on climate and make them separate scenarios, I think that would be a good thing. Also, I ask that you keep the 2035 goal in every scenario that you do, because the 2035 goal is really a lot more important than the 2050 goal. And so those are my three asks. And my question is, how sensitive is the Clear Path model to different strategies? Are there some areas that it's more sensitive on? And, because things like housing density can be kind of difficult to translate into those forecasts. So that's my question.
Yeah, so I understand where you're coming from with the question. It's a really good question. The challenge with these types of models is that they're mathematical rather than statistical. And so in that sense, and like my background is statistics rather than mathematics. So like I'm used to plotting all sorts of model sensitivity analyses, error analyses, et cetera. That somewhat falls out the window when we move out of statistics and move into essentially arithmetic. So the sensitivity really comes in with the assumptions that you build in. And so it's sort of like a pre-model sensitivity rather than the model itself. And that comes out in the discussions with primarily with the city and also some outside research in terms of the range of expected outcomes that we might receive. So to your point with housing, yes, it's super challenging because we need to make assumptions about where those people are moving from. Because if we're just shuffling people around Salem rather than adding new people, for example, or we're influencing the rate of population growth by putting in new housing, that would change our original forecasting. Those sorts of things are really important to determine and make assumptions about. And so it will be, and to your earlier comment on wanting to make sure the sources are listed, there will also be quite a detailed list of assumptions made, because no matter which one we pick, there will be a number of assumptions we selected that someone is likely to disagree with. And so it's important to note where we made those and why. And that will definitely be a part of the outcome here. Oh, I love this quote from Tom Anderson here. There are lies, there are blank lies, and there are statistics. And that is spot on. So I see a hand up from, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name here, Shane Griggs.
You pronounced it correctly.
Excellent. We're off to a good start then.
Yeah, very good start. Following up on your earlier comment about the large population that works in Salem but that does not live in Salem, we've all seen the positive impacts from COVID and the telecommuting that's had on our roads. And I know that the governor's has already given direction to some of the larger state agencies, at least, to figure out how what positions can continue to be a telecommute position and cut down on the number of people that are in state buildings, and so they can consolidate. So to what degree do you take advantage of that information when you're doing your forecasting or your strategies? And do we have somebody from the governor's staff, not DAS, but the governor's staff, in these conversations with you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, so from a capability standpoint, yes, we're capable of modeling what we might expect VMT to look like through time in terms of growth from population and redistribution of people due to technology. That is something I'm going to add to my list as something to follow up on further, because you being Salem are somewhat unique. There's 49 other examples, but you're unique in that you have a very large employer who isn't going anywhere. And in terms of they're not going to move to another city. And so that is relatively unique. When I think of most cities, there's only so much you can do, and not suggesting we ask everyone to work from home forevermore, but there is kind of an unusual relationship in that you have state government.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
John, I saw your hands up. I just want to make sure that wasn't if it's a second question, I'm happy to take it.
It's a second question. You said you're going to be sitting down with experts. Oh, what experts? And one of the things I'm going to encourage, and maybe they're already included in your experts, is there are a number of people at the state, Department of Energy, Department of BEQ, Transportation, have given a lot of thought to these issues in the state. So I encourage that, and we can get you names of the people to talk with.
Yeah, you're welcome to share. I'll always happily take more possible contacts.
So who is on your list of experts?
Yeah, so I'm adding now, thanks to Chain, that we will talk to somebody in regards to transportation from a higher state level. We'll be talking with some folks over at ICLEI in order to get a better understanding, because what I'm particularly interested in, I know some of this conversation is focusing on the forecasting. The tofu and broccoli portion, right, is the strategies. And so we've done quite a bit of legwork to make sure we're picking the right strategies. But ICLEI, that's in a large part what they do. And so we'll be working with them and a contact over there with them in order to essentially bounce our strategies off their list and sort of see what sticks, because we feel very confident with what we've narrowed down to. But I want their opinion as well.
We have two plans. You got a state energy plan from the Department of Energy. You also have a global warming commission plan. I would really encourage you to talk to those folks. DEQ is doing a lot of work in the transportation area as well.
Yeah, those are great. And we'll be talking with some folks in Salem city government as well in regards to transportation and land use. So folks that you've all interacted, the folks at least at Salem 350 have interacted with repeatedly. And that'll be in large part to help us get down the inputs, so to speak, of what's possible and what's optimistically possible. So I've scrolled through the chat, and it's certainly possible I missed a question. I didn't see one I missed, so I think we're okay on the chat side, but obviously if there's any more questions.
I was curious about what source you're using for population estimates.
Yeah, we've got, of course, I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but we've got, I believe it's the, Patricia, help me, or Julie, help me so I don't butcher it, but it's their population projections through the university.
Portland.
Is that Portland State?
Portland State.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the most likely one we will use moving forward. And that's what we've had some discussions about, sort of outside of the forecasting itself, about what the future might look like. So unofficial forecasting, so to speak, and that's what the population numbers we've used throughout that process.
What kind of equity variables are you looking at? Because, if equity is not in the data, it's usually just pushed aside and ignored. So I'm wondering, what kind of equity variables you're using, what kind of variables do the city, staff, what kind of data do they have access to? Are you using like census data? Can we make suggestions for equity variables that you include?
Well, yes, certainly to the last question. Your suggestions are absolutely welcome. So yeah, that's the challenge, right? So those discussions will be coming up as we kind of nail down the top 10 to make sure. The challenge is that, as I've alluded to a very light degree, and so not addressing anywhere near the depth of equity issues possible, these strategies are going to affect different people differently. And I've broken it down right now, and that's not where it's going to stay. It's simply just people that live in Salem and people that don't live in Salem. And I realize there's a lot more complexity than that. But we are thinking about that at a relatively high level right now as we're trying to pick these strategies, because in addition to the weighting system we have, it's obviously clear that the populations for each strategy are going to be different in terms of who they impact, some positively, some negatively. We're also working with our partner Ecotone, and they're going to be doing a more in-depth cost-benefit analysis for these strategies. And part of that includes a much deeper dive into equity and for whom the benefits are coming out and at what level. So that's a much more detailed economic analysis. But obviously, if there's something that's on your mind, we're more than happy to take that input.
Yeah, the environmental justice groups in Oregon really hate cost-benefit analysis, and they've been moving to a different metric, which is like a community benefit analysis, because often the cost-benefit analysis doesn't include the cost of doing nothing, right? Which is getting more and more expensive on both, equity and climate. So I'd love to talk more about kind of like what they are including with cost-benefit, and if we could even kind of move equity into the cost benefit.
Yeah, and there's which I can't remember the date, so I'll look to Kim for the answer there. For our next workshop, we are having an individual from Ecotone who's doing that analysis come to speak a little bit about their tool.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that too, Janet. At the February 17th workshop, we will have, he's an economist who will be doing this analysis. And this firm, Ecotone Analytics, they're out of Minneapolis, and they are very concerned with equity impacts as well. And they've developed kind of a unique way of doing economic analysis that does look at how various costs and benefits accrue to different stakeholders within a community. So look forward to hearing more from him, but we would love to hear if you have suggestions for variables, as you mentioned, to track. That would help Will as he's getting started on his analysis. So please send those to us.
All right, I see some more hands. Wendy, I'd love to take your input or question.
Yeah, well, yes, my comment is really, I just want to support Councillor Anderson and Janet's comments on the environmental equity. I serve on the Governor's Environmental Equity, who serves at the pleasure of the Racial Justice Council. I hear that you have someone that you're going to bring in, but I strongly encourage you. There's so much local work and expertise that's being done on the equity frontier, that with exactly what Janet mentioned, which was the community minded, that I encourage you to reach out to the Racial Justice Council, because I've been working intensely with a group of people for 4 months on equity variables legislation that I think there's so much gains for this group to tap into some of that information.
Yeah, that's great input. Thank you. We can certainly reach out to you. I know we're closing in on time here, but I would like to follow up with you a little bit more on that. So we'll certainly do so. I see a hand from Phil.
Yes, I wanted to probe a little bit on what you mean by a strategy. And just as an example, the Milwaukee, Oregon Climate Action Plan has quite a bit more than 10 strategies. And especially within the realm of reducing vehicle miles traveled, it seems like there's a lot of coordinated activity to make walking, biking, busing more pleasant or quicker or cheaper. And if I could, we've submitted 350 has submitted more than 10 suggested policies or strategies related just to VMT, and then there's the reducing the emissions per mile traveled, or electrification largely of vehicles, and then there's the reducing emissions from the stationary sources, or the big pieces. But especially in the VMT reduction, what do you mean by a strategy? There's a lot that can be done, and it's going to be hard to know exactly what the effect of a particular strategy would be, or a narrowly defined almost tactic.
Yeah, so two answers to your question there. So one, yes, there are a number of strategies that aren't going to get analyzed in this specific way, and so as you'll probably recall from the last workshop, a lot of the strategies, I know I'm speaking separately from the ones you submitted, but a lot of them don't necessarily have an impact on GHG emissions, which is what we're specifically talking about right now, or at least the effect would be indirect or small, right? So like when we talked about like locally sourced food, for example, those are all really great things from a resilience, from a community, from an equity lens, but they don't really impact what we're talking about specifically right now. So that's in part, I mean, of all the strategies, that's going to take away a piece of them, right? And then secondly, to your point, yes, there's a lot of detail that has to go into each one of these strategies, which is why we're not going to analyze them all in this way. It doesn't mean they won't be in the climate action plan. It's sort of a feasibility challenge in terms of trying to get through all of the strategies. And that's why we're picking ones that we believe would hit that compromise between being feasible and cost effective, but also have a significant impact on overall GHG emissions. So to get to like an example of what we mean by a strategy, like a possible strategy would be, for example, improve public transit speed, reliability, and user experience. And then the details underneath that come in of, okay, well, what's that mean from how often are we going to change the bus route service? Is it going to be every 15 minutes? Is it going to be every 30 minutes? What do we expect that to do to ridership? Included in that one could be, changing the fee structure or eliminating fees for the bus, right? I mean, those both kind of fit in. So there's the strategies that are quantitative to an extent that because they're built on sort of, this is the challenge of verbiage here, but the strategy is relatively broad, but it's built on several sort of tactics, is the word you used, that are like deliberate changes we're going to make. So in that change the user experience, speed, reliability, that might include, for example, 5 of the examples that you sent, right? So those are all going to get wrapped up into one bigger piece. And then through those discussions, it'll be how does each one of these possibly impact either VMT or land use change or et cetera, in terms of their outcome, which is then what we take into the GHG modeling. So I hope that answers your question. You look dissatisfied with my response.
Well, no, it's just, I don't have an answer to how to do this. I'm a modeler, and I know the challenge, you have to have a very specific set of tactics and measures to make a strategy, say, to reduce commuting as opposed to other kinds of travel, car travel. So and so it's I think we'll just have to proceed and try to package these things in big enough chunks that they do some good, but are specific enough that the city can implement them. And so I think it's a challenge to limit it. I know you have to limit to some number to model. That's the finite resource we're husbanding here. And so I think it's getting the reducing VMT is too big a strategy, but
right.
Some of the individual measures to reduce VMT are too small. And so it's how do we aggregate those up into bunches that are kind of conceptually whole or identifiable.
Perfect. You're hitting right on the challenge of this exercise. Yes, you are correct in that. It is a matter of finding what's the meaningful level.
Thank you.
Can I weigh in on this? I never disagree with Dr. Carver. I think you need to be clear on the terms you're going to use, because I've heard a lot of terms: strategies, tactics, actions. To me, strategies is a fairly high level, of an approach, and there's going to be many actions that should be under that I expect to see in this plan. That includes who does it and how it's going to be done, because you're not going to get a significant reduction in transportation emissions without a lot of very small actions, and a couple of big ones.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. All right. Well, I know we're at time, and I don't think I see any more hands unless I'm missing anybody here.
John has his hand up.
Oh, it disappeared. So there, we're good. So I would like to end to just say that I thank you for your questions, and I know that we have to schedule these things out fairly far in advance, but I would not encourage this to be the end of the discussion whatsoever. And I do see one more hand, so we'll take that before we end here. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. Yeah, Brian, my question, and I put it in the chat, was I'm most curious about all these strategies that ICLEI has and how customizable they are to conditions in Salem. So my concern is many of these strategies say do X and expect Y. And I don't know how detailed they are. I don't know how customizable they are. And I'd like you to answer that kind of question.
Well, yeah, I would say that, so when we put together a strategy list from which we were going to try to subset down to 10 for the purposes of this exercise, the vast majority of those come from the workshop. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of it's not surprising that what comes out in that workshop is also what's in other organizations or other cities' climate action plans. Not surprising that they're in best practice examples, et cetera. So it's a good point, and I would just at this point say that I think all of what we're looking at right now has come up directly in the workshop. So I think that the concern is well noted, but maybe not applicable in this situation. I think we don't have sort of this broad like international level scope we're bringing to the top 10.
Okay, but the tool still is from ICLEI, right? The tool.
Yes.
Let's say you mentioned the example of increasing frequencies of buses. If we use some national model, it may not really fit with what is happening in Salem Kaiser. So can we tweak any of those so that they best fit Salem Kaiser?
Yeah, so that's when, if we don't think the model is going to do what we need it to do, then that's when we hop out of the model, and we'll still follow the protocol because that isn't of concern, at least in my mind. But that's when we go to have a discussion about, well, if we doubled bus service, what would we expect for ridership? And those aren't numbers that we're going to pull from an international level. We'll do our best to have kind of local discussions about that, and barring a good example or a good discussion about that, then that's when we will do research about comparable cities. So yeah, we won't be making, I understand your point, we won't be making assumptions like that.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we've, at least for now, addressed all the questions. I'd certainly encourage you to follow up with any others that you have. And I'd just like to thank you for your time for the last hour and for some really great conversation. I think it probably comes as the surprise of no one. We had no problem filling up an extra half hour and then some. So thanks, and appreciate your time, and look forward to reconnecting again here in the fairly near future.
Brian.